almost from day one or day two, we were in two offices. And at first, until actually our latest round, which was our Series D with Sequoia in May last year, we were very much like well, none of us remember, we were not born, but like the Soviet Empire between the First and the Second World War. So geographic specialization, steel in Ukraine, wheat in Georgia, coal in Siberia, and on paper it's very efficient, but if anything happens anywhere, the entire empire dies.
And I'd like to start at the very start of the story of Dashlane. Dashlane has a sort of particular founding story, one that we don't necessarily hear, and as a CEO, you definitely have a very particular story as well. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what motivated you to join Dashlane in the very, very earliest days, because before that you were running a very different type of company with thousands of employees, hundreds of millions in revenue, and you decided to start something with three guys in a room and not much more than a vision.
Yes, indeed, it was an interesting story because so we started Dashlane really as a company, at least on its current trajectory, towards the end of 2010, and my story before that is that I'd mostly run larger or much larger company. I think the largest one was about 10,000 people and about 2 billion in revenue. The smallest was about 1,200 people, a few hundred million in revenue. And I was, my background is as a software engineer, like many people in tech. But I was looking for what at the time I called a real job in a small company, which was again, a few hundred million and a few thousand people, because that's what I knew how to do. And as I was looking for a job, I was on LinkedIn, and one day I saw an ad it was a very short ad. It said, Internet Startup Paris CEO, and then there was a name attached to it for a gentleman called Bernard Liotto, who is more known in Europe than in the US, but he was the founder and CEO of a company called Business Object, which he sold for about 7 billion to SAP, and he's now the guy who runs Balderton Capital in London. If you want to raise money, that's one of the best funds in Europe. And so I saw that ad, and immediately it sounded like a very small company. In fact, it was not even a company, but his name was very interesting because this guy is on the board of many larger companies, and I was looking for a CEO job, so he was a good person to network with. So I sent him a letter saying, look, this is probably way too small for me, but if you have, a normal company for which you're looking for a CEO, then I'd love to talk to you. And then I forgot about it. And 2 months later, that guy, who is, again, very famous, one of the few, at the time, he was the only sort of French tech billionaire. He called me and he told me a little bit about what the company was, and but it was not really a company. It was three guys still in school working on some technology, and he asked me if I was interested to learn more. So I spent about a month. They were in Ménilmontant. I was living in Belleville, so it was easy. They were 10 minutes from my house. I spent a month with them, and they were working on, that's a way to describe it. But another way to describe it is you have a simple way to describe it, which is helping people with their digital identity and their passwords. The way we call it is fixing the UX of the internet, but it was at an extremely early stage. And I spent a month with them, helped them figure out what their business plan would be, help them think about how they could grow the product. And I did a 10-page PowerPoint to give to Bernard Liotto to say, this is what I think you should do with this ID. And he asked me if I wanted to join as CEO. And I said, look, it's very nice. I'm very honored that you're offering me this. But, the smallest company I've run has more than 1,000 people. So, you can't even pay me, and you don't have any money, and this is not really something I should do. And I was actually taking the Eurostar from Paris to London to meet with him to say no to his very nice offer. And I sat across from a headhunter I had worked with in the past to hire executives, and she asked me what I was going to do in London. And I told her about all the meetings I was going to have with, private equity firms to discuss real jobs in real companies. And I told her, I'm also meeting with Bernard Liotto, you know of him, and he has this, startup ID, but you agree with me, I should never do that. Because it's career suicide to, go start a company like that. And she said, no, I don't know, what are your goals in life? And professionally, at least. And I said, well, I want to go back into tech. She said, well, that sounds like a tech company. And I want something that's going to be global. And she said, well, passwords, identity, that's global. And I want something that's going to be fast growth. And she said, well, when you start from zero, it's easy to grow fast, which is true. And so she convinced me on the way from Paris to London to actually change my mind. And I was going in this meeting to say no. And I said, yes, I'm willing to try for a year. And that was 9 years ago. And it's the best job I've ever had. And it's still a very small company. We are only about 260.
So it's still the smallest company you've ever run?
It is still the smallest company I've ever run, yes.
And another sort of particular decision that you made is that very early on you decided that because it was a global company, you'd go to the US. And so I was wondering if you could walk us through that thought process, because the three co-founders, well, the four of you, who were all French, right? Or at least based in Paris. You decided that it was going to be a US headquartered company. Why was that? You also only raised from US VCs.
Yes, that's correct. So at the time I met my other three co-founders, I was just coming back from the US where I had spent, now I've been about 16 years in the US, but I had already spent 8 years in the US, which was a good part of my career. And one thing struck me about what the vision of the company was that there was nothing about it that was attached to France other than the people. The problem we were solving or are solving is the same whether you are in Ukraine, Indonesia, or Florida. The solution we were building had very little relationship to geography or language or anything, and so it struck me that I asked them the question, why would we start in France? And the answer was, well, because we are there. And my answer, well, why is that relevant? The internet is everywhere. Like, it doesn't matter where we are. And my thinking was based on two observations. The first one is, or three observations actually. The first one is, as a market, the US is 10 to 15 times bigger in terms of economic weight than a country like France. Europe is bigger than the US, but Europe is not a unified market. You have a patchwork of regulation, language is different, cultures are very different. Ask a German, a French, and an English to agree on anything is very hard. And so Europe is not really a unified market except in some very specific senses. The US, to a large extent, is. So you have a market that's much bigger to start with. That was number one. Number two, and I think it's much less true today, which is very relevant to you guys, but at the time, the first round of money we raised, our Series A, was 8 million in total. We had no product, no users, nothing. We just had a shitty PowerPoint. And in 2011, raising 8 million from French VCs with a shitty PowerPoint was probably not doable, even if you have a great idea. So the second reason was that the US market, it was easier to raise large rounds. It's still true. You can raise much larger rounds in the US, but I think at early stage, there is now a pretty strong sort of VC ecosystem in France. The third reason is more of a competitive nature, but when you're working on a global product, if you have the choice between becoming the number one in France or the number one in the US, it's much better to become the number one in the US, because then it's going to be very hard for anybody to get funded, because any VC is going to look at the market and say, well, this is a global market, there is already a leader in the US, why are you going to win? And so from a competitive standpoint, it made sense, because at the end of the day, it's not harder to launch a company in the US, especially if you know the market. So that was the decision process. And so effectively, we built the product in France, but we launched it in the US, and we did what I think maybe something you know about, but we did what's called a flip, which is when we raised our first round of equity, we created a US company, and the French entity became a subsidiary of the US company. So effectively, from the earliest part of our history, we've really been a US company, even though the majority of our employees is still in France.
And you didn't, I mean, you didn't choose to go to San Francisco, which I think is what a lot of SaaS companies do when they're based, in Paris. The first office in the US that they open tends to be San Francisco. Increasingly, New York is the case, and I think you were quite early on that. Why did you decide New York? You were there, obviously, before.
Yeah, so I've had the chance to live and work in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in Boston, in New York. So I know at least I don't know the stuff in the middle, what's green, but what's on the side, I have a fair sense of what it looks like. And the thing is that I've actually run a long time ago during the first internet bubble, an internet startup with...
Why the first? Are you saying that we're in a second one now?
No, I'm only implying that it's the first. It doesn't mean there will be a second. We can talk about that. I actually don't believe it's the case. But at that time, I was running a company with the headquarters in San Francisco and a big team in Paris, and it just didn't work. I mean, it's not that it doesn't work, it's that it's so much harder that unless you have a really good reason to be in San Francisco, actually, if you have teams in Europe, it's much better to be in New York. Just consider two things. With our engineering team in Paris, they tend to work quite late. Our team in New York tends to get in the office quite early. We have between 5 and 6 hours of overlap. We spend our entire life in Zoom calls. So we have 5 or 6 hours to work together. If you're in San Francisco, you remove at least 3 of that. So now you're down to 2 or 3 hours, and keeping a cohesive culture becomes extremely hard. And on top of that, if you are the CEO or the founder and you have to travel between the two cities, I encourage you to test doing Paris, San Francisco 3 times a month. You're not going to live very old because it's just like physically too hard. And so there are a few companies today that would need to work and to be based in San Francisco if you need to partner with the ecosystem there. If you need to be close to Cisco, to Palo Alto Network, to Facebook. But even that is less and less true. And from a capital standpoint, yes, there is more capital in San Francisco, but it's completely irrelevant because you can already raise billions of dollars in New York. So until you get to the point where you need to raise billions of dollars, it doesn't really make a difference.
And so that was actually the next question I had for you, which is true, you have a lot more overlap than you would have if you'd HQ'd in San Francisco, but you're still running 2 very separate offices. Well, actually 3 now with the office in Portugal as well. And I was wondering sort of what conscious efforts you make to preserve the culture between the 2 offices. One of the things you mentioned when we were preparing was that you said everything everywhere, and I was wondering if you could run us through that.
So maybe just a few to give you a sense of the company, because it's better to have a sort of dimensions in mind. So today we are, I don't know exactly because we are hiring about 20 to 25 people a month, but we are approximately 250, 260. We are based in 3 cities, New York, Paris, and Lisbon. We started, as I said, about almost 10 years ago. We've exclusively actually raised money from US VCs. Some of them you may know, Sequoia Capital, Bessemer, First Mark Capital. In total, we've raised about 210 million. We have about 12 million customers, of which the overwhelming majority are individuals. And in terms of businesses, it's about 10 to 11,000 companies. What else can I say? Yeah, that gives you a sense of the company. So we, almost from day 1 or day 2, we were in 2 offices. And at first, until actually our latest round, which was our Series D with Sequoia in May last year, we were very much like none of us remember, we were not born, but like the Soviet Empire between the First and the Second World War. So geographic specialization, steel in Ukraine, wheat in Georgia, coal in Siberia. And on paper, it's very efficient, but if anything happens anywhere, the entire empire dies. So for us, it was not exactly the problem, but we had product and engineering in Paris, customer support in Lisbon, and everything else, sales, marketing, and useless people like me in New York. And then, that's fine, but then you raise a lot of money. You have to start growing at a crazy speed in terms of recruiting. As I said, we are hiring about 20 people a month. and you realize that like any given market is too small. Like try hire 15 developers every month in Paris, it's just the market is not big enough. And so we reconsidered the problem, because at first we said we're only going to hire developers in Paris or maybe in Lisbon, because if you take the same engineer in Paris and in Lisbon, there is a 2.5x difference in cost. So, you know, like engineering salaries in New York are, I'm even embarrassed to share them. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars for an experienced engineer. It's absolutely crazy. And so when you don't have massive amounts of capital, you're much better off not having your engineering in New York, because anyway, you know, it's not going to be very efficient. When we got to a point where we had, like that's actually it was my message to the company at the end of the year. For 8 years, we've been in a situation where we have not a lot of money and a lot of time. Today, it's exactly the opposite. We have a lot of money, but we don't have time anymore. And so if speed becomes the priority, what you do is what we did, which is we went from Soviet Empire model to everything everywhere, which means when we open a new position, we say, you know, you can join in Paris, Lisbon, and New York, it doesn't matter. A great example is last September, we were fortunate to hire the chief marketing officer from Lyft, the competitor of Uber, to join Dashlane as CMO. And Joy Howard, and when I made the offer to her, I said, you know, part of the deal is you decide where you want to live. You can live in New York, you can live in Lisbon, you can live in Paris, you can build your team anywhere. And that was part of what attracted her to the company. She visited the 3 cities and she picked Paris.
That's very cool. I was actually going to speak about Joy a bit later on. One of the things that I also wanted to talk about, you talked about the very intense growth that you had to go through. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the different stages. So there's one stage where you know everybody in the company by name and you probably interact with them on a daily basis. One where you start having, you know, the beginnings of middle management. And now you're at the point where you definitely don't know everyone. And you're adding, you know, you told me, I don't have the exact number. Oh yeah, it's 50% of the people weren't here 9 months ago. So you're getting to a pace where there's huge amounts of people. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how you manage that and how your management style evolved. Because these were all things that were very new to you as a CEO.
Yeah, the kind of growth, indeed very new, because as I said, I've run large companies, but they were large, old companies, so they were not changing that quickly. Now it's a young, fast growth company. So the first thing, I mean, it's partly related to your question, but in the early days when we didn't have a lot of capital, I was always dreaming about, you know, at some point in the future, we're going to raise a big round and everything is going to be fantastic and easy and cool and rosy because we're going to have so much money. I was completely wrong. It's when you start having a lot of money and you raise a big round, that's when things get really, really hard and really, really painful, for the very simple reason that the type of targets you've now set for yourself are incredibly higher. And the type of growth you're going to encounter is going to go from reasonable to very, very painful. And one of the things you're saying, which is you don't know everyone, is that's one of the manifestations. But another element of that is that everything you've built before starts breaking because it was not built for that scale and that speed. So yes, indeed, there are stages. I think the very first stage is when everyone fits in one room. First, because you don't have money to have more than one room, and second, because the team is small enough. And you know everything about everyone because you spend your time with 2, 3, 4 people. And then, you know, you start to get to, you know, 20, 30 people, and it starts to feel more like a company, because when you have 20, 30 people, you start to have some level of management. You don't have one person with 30 direct reports. So that's the first stage where you pretend to be as structured as a company, but of course you are not, because you can't afford it. And then, you know, you cross more stages, and two things change. One thing that is very hard for founders is when you have to accept that the initial team that was around you, and sometimes your co-founders, are not necessarily, which naturally in the beginning were the first leaders and the first manager of the company. Of course, they are the co-founders. But often for them, if it's their first company or their first job, or That works up to a point, and then there is a point where it's very hard to ask someone for whom it's their first job to manage 20 people, 50 people. It's not something that is always intuitive for anyone. And so you start bringing from the outside people that were not there in the beginning, but that start to have roles that are more important than some of the people that legitimately feel that they founded the company or they were very early on. And that's the first big shock for your culture. The next big shock for your culture is when you realize that the first team of managers and leaders that you have hired is not anymore the right one. So now you're at the second iteration where you had brought these people because they had experience managing or leading teams, but they had experience only up to a certain scale. And now you need people that have been in public companies that have run much larger organizations, and you have to do a second iteration where these leaders you had hired and you had brought and that helped you build the company to that level, they have to accept that there's going to be someone above them and that are not going to report to you again. So you go through these multiple culture shocks that you have to anticipate. And yes, the last one is that point where, you know, as the CEO, you don't know anyone anymore. And you cross people that, you know, you're not sure what their name is, and so we're trying to find solutions to that. One, there was a point until 18 months ago where I was still interviewing every new employee that was joining the company, and I made a point of that. And one day, my chief people officer came to see me and said, you know, you are the reason why we can't hire fast enough. You're slowing us down. It's terrible. You've become the bottleneck, so you're not allowed to interview people below a certain level. And I said, okay, but I accept your decision, but you need to find a way for me to know them personally. And so that's when you need to come up with things that scale. So it sounds like a small thing, but it's very important. Now we've organized lunches in every office, and I travel between them so I can meet in person each and every new employee and have them tell me their story, and I tell them my story. And so you have to try and maintain that link. And every time I go to an office, I go to our website. I look at the pictures of everyone with their names so I can try and memorize them, and if I encounter them, can know who they are. But it's hard.
So one thing you touched upon is the latest round that you raised with Sequoia. I read in an interview that right before you raised the round, you'd secured a big venture debt round, and that you actually weren't thinking or sort of considering raising venture money until then. And I was wondering if you could tell us how Sequoia managed to change your mind, or why you decided to change your mind. And then what's going to change your mind next time somebody comes and tries to convince you to do 5 or 10x?
So a few elements to answering your question. The first one is we are in a business. We are a subscription business where millions of people pay us for our product, and so it's a very predictable growth model, and so we have and we have extremely low churn. Essentially, people who have been subscribers of Dashlane for more than 2 years, they essentially stop when they die. So you're talking about 1 or 2% churn a year, and so with that, you have the ability to attract another form of capital, which is debt. The advantage of debt is that it's non-dilutive. You get money, you have to pay it back in the future, but you don't give away shares in your company. And so when you have that instrument at your disposal, which is the case for us, it's very attractive. And on top of that, today you have debt structures that allow you to borrow money as a multiple of your recurring revenue, for instance. So you can typically, you can borrow, if your revenue grows fast, then you can borrow the equivalent of 1 times your ARR. Everybody is familiar with that, or 1 times your revenue. Annual recurring revenue. So if you can borrow the equivalent of 1 times your revenue, and your revenue doubles or triples every year, it means you have actually access to a lot of cheap capital if your revenue is predictable. So because of that, we had, actually in February, so about a year ago, we had closed another round of about 30 million of debt, and that was enough for our business plan for at least the next 18 months and probably forever. Because as we could borrow more with the growth of our revenue, today we our budget for this year is to finish the year at about between 55 and 60 million in revenue. Next year at about 100. So we have access to a lot of that. So we had essentially decided, because I was fed up with dilution and talking to VCs, and I mean they are very nice. Any VC in the room, but I'm done with raising capital from VCs. But there's one guy called Jim Gutz, who is like in the world of VCs, it's a world with a lot of vanity, and they have a ranking, a classement of the best VCs in the world. It's like, I don't know what's comparable to that. Anyway, it's a top 50 of but it's not the firms, it's actually the people. So the most prestigious VC, it's called the Forbes Midas list of top VCs. And you have the top 100 individual investors in the world, all part of the biggest firms. And Jim is a guy who not only has been on the Midas list forever, he has been in the top 10 forever, but he's actually been the #1 of the Midas list for, 5 years or 6 years in a row. He's the guy who did WhatsApp, he did Palo Alto Networks, some of the biggest investments and successes in the world. And Jim is a customer of our product, has been a customer for many years. And every year, every 6 months, he was coming to New York, coming to see me and say, when can we do something together? And I don't know, it was never the right time, and and last February, 2 weeks after we had raised our round of debt, he sends me an email saying, I'm going to be, and he sends the day before, like usual, I'm going to be in New York tomorrow, can I see you? And I was like, oh God, I'm going to spend an hour with Jim again, and what are we going to talk about? We've just raised 30 million. And the thing that's incredible, and if you find any VC like that, don't let that one go. He's the kind of guy who, when he's 3 minutes late for a meeting, he sends an apology email in advance saying, I'm sorry, I'm 3 minutes late. And he's the most famous VC in the world. So, that's a very rare combination. And so he comes into the meeting and he says, how are you doing? And I say, well, we've just raised 30 million. He's like, what? You didn't call me? Anyway. And I said, but it's okay, don't worry, it's debt. And in the meeting, he sensed that because we had access to debt, we would probably never raise money again. And so right in the meeting, he said, okay. And he essentially made me an offer. And the valuation, but that's not what, so we need to talk about that. Of course, the offer was very attractive. The amount was very high. It was 110 million. The valuation was very high too. But I said, I said, I'm not sure what to do with that money. Because it's important to understand that, money comes at a price. And the price is not just dilution. Dilution, that's easy. It's math. You calculate, you give X% of your company. If you grow by that much, it's worth it. The problem with raising money is not that you get diluted. The problem with raising money is that you change the exit trajectory. Because if you raise money and after that round your company is worth, $600 million, of post money, then whatever happens, you need to exit at a multiple of that, which means if you raise money at 600 million in post money, whether it's in an IPO or a sale, you need to exit at $1 or $2 or $3 billion. You don't have a choice. Otherwise, you're going to get massively diluted by the liquidation preferences of the VC. So when you raise money, you are making a huge bet on the fact that that money is going to put you on a fundamentally different trajectory. Because if it does not, you should not take that money. It's poisonous, really, unless you are sure that with that money you can make something different. And I think in that conversation, what Jim convinced me about was not that we could have a fundamentally different trajectory, but that he could help me get on that fundamentally different trajectory, because Sequoia as a firm and him as an investor are just on a different planet. And 7 months in, I think it's true that they're on a different planet. It's not fun every day, but they do put you on a different trajectory.
Thanks a lot for that. So I have 2 last questions before we open to the floor. The first one, and sort of talking about this new trajectory, you mentioned joy earlier on. So I actually did a couple tests with my friends before we came here, and some of them who are in tech knew Dashlane, some of them who aren't didn't really know, and I think that it says something about your evolution as a consumer brand. So like the sort of early adopters for sure definitely know what Dashlane is, but there's still some work to be done, and Joy's recruitment was definitely something for that. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what the plan was in building that brand.
Yeah, I'll talk about her and also how I met her, because it's a funny story. So Joy is an incredible woman. She started her career for about 9 or 10 years as a rock and rap musician. Professional, I mean, not. And then she was a senior level marketer at Coke. Then I think she was running the Converse, at Coke. Then she was leading the Converse brand for Nike. So again, very senior marketer. Then she became the CMO of Patagonia, the brand you all know. She then became the CMO of Sonos. I think many of you know that brand. And then she was the CMO of Lyft. So she was on this incredible trajectory as probably one of the best marketers in the US. And I initially interviewed her as a potential board member, because I was doing a search for a new independent board member to join our board, because one of the things you have to do when you start preparing your company 3 years in advance for potentially an IPO is you've got to start changing your board to kick out the VCs and replace them with independent directors, because you can't have a board.
Jim, the others.
Yes, not Jim, the others. No, and it's not a question of person. It's more that if you have a board that only has VC, you can't go public as a company. And so I was in the final stages of hiring a new board member, and I was talking to 2 people, Joy, the CMO of Lyft, and a gentleman called Seth Farbman, who was, at that time, he just left, the CMO of Spotify. So 2 of the best marketers in the world, because I wanted a very strong consumer marketer on our board. And I ended up hiring Seth for the board because he was based in New York, and because Spotify, as a consumer subscription business, was really so close to the challenges we had that I thought he would be a great addition, and he has been a great addition, by the way. And I offered him the job, and I called Joy saying, look, I wish we could have worked together, but I've decided to make the offer to someone else. And I was very interested in her because, just like Jim, by the way, and that's a common thread in our story, she had been a customer of Dashlane for 5 years, and she was fascinated by our space, by privacy, and I said, sorry, I hope we'll have an opportunity to work together in the future. But I didn't know that both candidates I was talking to were really good friends. And the night after that, Seth had dinner with Joy and told her, oh, you don't know what's happening to me. I've been hired by Emmanuel Schalit to join the board of Dashlane. And she said, fuck you, like that was, sorry, she didn't say it like that, but she said, that was my job. And the conversation continued, and Seth knew that we were looking for a new CMO. And he started talking to her about, would you join as CMO? But you have to realize, Lyft is well, not anymore, but they were a $20 billion publicly traded tech company, incredibly visible. And before that, she had been at another public company, Sonos. And we are, at the time when she joined, we were, 160 people. So it was completely unthinkable to make a hire like that. Like, I had not even had the idea to have her join the team. And so when, Seth called me and said, she might be interested. It was an incredible moment. And she joined the company in September, and we are already a very, very different company, and we'll be even more so in a few weeks in a few days when we completely relaunch our brand, and there will be massive investments in the tens of millions of dollars behind that relaunch.
So last question, because we're in Europe. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how the attitude to privacy has changed in the 10 years you've been running Dashlane, and in particular, if there's been any impact at all with everything that's been happening on European regulation. Do people care more? Do people not care more? You actually have numbers on that because you see whether people sign up more. So I was wondering if you could give us some color.
Well, first thing I'll say, because privacy matters, is there are certain numbers we can't see and we don't want to see and we don't look at. But that point aside, yes, I'd say 2 or 3 things have happened. And in no particular order, but, yes, the first thing that has happened, there was a great article in the New York Times last week, which I think the title was, it was about the last decade, the 2010s, so 2010 to 2020. And the title of the article was, I think, the decade where tech lost its way. And the entire thesis of that article was that, if we remember, in the last 10 years, what has changed is fundamentally that the internet for the last 10 years has been based on a very simple deal, which is you give me your data, I give you services in exchange, and there's no money changing hands. And on the surface, it looks like a great deal. Especially when we are younger, we are really happy to get lots of services for free. But what the last 2 or 3 years have started to reveal, to unearth, is that there is something potentially very, very dangerous in a deal like that. And not very dangerous because me as an individual, people are going to know which websites I browse, and that's a problem. But there are much bigger problems at work now. We have seen very clear examples where that data can be weaponized to impact elections in the second biggest democracy in the world. The first one is India, the second one in the US. So the things that are happening around data are not just about what's happening to us individually. They have a profound impact on society, which it's unclear we're going to be able to undo some of the damage that has been done. I heard a former guy from Google at a conference last year who was, it was very interesting the way he was talking about this. He was saying, I don't necessarily agree with you, but it's a way to think about it. So, how do you say that in English? Imagine the situation where, you go to church, you go to confession, and you enter the confessional and you talk to the priest. I think even if you don't go to church, you get the image. You've seen enough movies. Now, imagine that the priest is actually talking to not 10 or 20, but 4 billion people individually. And now imagine that the priest knows not just what they tell him in the confessional, but everything they do outside and every place they go at every time. And imagine that the priest also has the most powerful set of supercomputers to actually do stuff with that data. And now imagine that priest with the supercomputer and the 4 billion talking to him, and where he knows everything they do all the time, as a business model that is based on reselling that data to advertisers. That's not very cool, actually, when you think about the consequences. And we are seeing them again in things that really matter, that impact democracies, that impact elections, because it can be manipulated. And so this topic is actually not just about, what's happening to me as an individual. It has much, much deeper historical consequences. Now, what has changed is that I think when I say what I just said, it kind of, at least you understand what I'm talking about. You may not agree with me, but you have a sense of what I am talking about because you've heard about it, because the news is talking about that all the time. So the first thing that has changed is people understand that there is at least a question and potentially a problem depending on what they believe. Among the people that understand that, you have regulators. Oh my God. And in particular, European regulators, because for cultural reasons, we Europeans, I'm half and half, but we Europeans probably care more about that than Americans do. And so the EU has a big advantage over the US, which is for all the things that we say don't work about the EU has a parliament that is able to pass laws, actually, and a lot of them. Whereas in the US, it's a little bit more complicated, and it's not just because of Trump that it's complicated. It was complicated before. So the EU, you have a parliament that's functioning, that's creating regulations, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and they did this thing called GDPR. And then something happened that nobody anticipated. Everybody has heard of GDPR? Yes, you all have. So something happened that nobody anticipated, which is that all the big tech companies, all the small tech companies, I'm sure for those of you that have digital properties, said, okay, well, even if we are not in Europe, we have to be compliant with GDPR for our European users, because otherwise, we could be seeing massive fines. So the bigger you are as a company, the less choice you have. And so you have all these tech companies, large and small, that have had to change their infrastructure, change their data policies internally, change their consent and everything to comply with GDPR. And it's actually more complicated for them to comply with GDPR in Europe and not do it everywhere else. I mean, it introduces a lot of complexity in their business. So de facto, GDPR, even though nobody saw that coming, has become the privacy standard in the world, even though it was just created for the EU. And I actually made a conference about that and wrote a few articles about that. You have this, if you think about the first 20 or 25 years of the internet, they have been largely driven by the US with the lever of innovation. The US has had the venture capital infrastructure, they've had the intellectual horsepower to create the internet and define it through innovation. And now we are seeing the other swing of the pendulum in the other direction, where Europe, through regulation, is actually shaping potentially the next wave of changes in the internet, because they have an ability to create standards that have a very global impact. And you're seeing signs of that in the US, but clearly today the standard is GDPR.
Thanks a lot.